In 1991, a man named Boucard Diouf lands at a small airport in Quebec, a place called Montjoly, way up along the St. Lawrence, where the river is so wide it might as well be the sea. He's coming from Senegal to start a graduate degree, and he steps off the plane dressed for the country he just left. Sandals, a light African robe. It's winter, and winter up there can mean -40. He has a joke about that moment that I love. People had prepared him for culture shock, he says. They'd warned him all about the culture shock. They just forgot to mention that ici, it can be -40. And that word, ici, that's not the ici you and I learned in French class for here. Ici is how they say it there. So even the weather on his very first day was already speaking Quebec French at him. He also likes to say that back home in Senegal, the lion is the king of the jungle. But here, the cold is king. Everything bows to the cold. He stays anyway. He does his doctorate in Rimouski, in oceanography. And his thesis, I'm not making this up, his thesis is about how smelt survive in freezing water. Smelt, the little silverfish, about as long as your hand. So a man from a country where it's 40 degrees in the shade spent years studying how a small fish stays alive in ice water. He jokes about it himself. Like, what was the plan exactly? Bring that specialty home to Senegal? And the whole time, the language keeps pulling little pranks on him. One day, a neighbor offers him some fromage en crotte. And if you run that through your France-French dictionary, it comes out somewhere around cheese droppings. It's cheese curds, the squeaky cheese, the poutine cheese. Completely delicious, just a horrifying name if you're new. And then one night, in a bar, the language stops being cute. A man comes up to him, and Boucard has said this was one of the rare times in Quebec he ran into real racism. So this man was not coming over to make friends. And he asks, "Veux-tu manger une claque?" Do you want to eat a claque? Boucard doesn't know that word yet. What he does know is that he's new here, that he's polite, and that this place keeps feeding him strange things with strange names. Squeaky cheese, fish out of ice water. So, sure, a claque. Maybe that's another local thing you eat. So, he says yes. A claque is a slap. The man was asking, do you want a smack? And Boucard, brand new, smiling, polite, said, yes, please. And the way he tells it, j'en ai mangé toute une. He ate a whole one. He tells that story on stage now. He became one of Quebec's best-known storytellers, actually. This Senegalese biologist from the Bas du Fleuve who fills theaters with the exact expressions that used to ambush him. And when he tells it, it's funny. Everybody laughs. I laughed. But remember this part. He already spoke French when he landed. Just not this French. "30-some years later, another airport, Montreal this time. Midnight. Me. I was trying to do the most boring thing in the world, buy a bus pass. The vending machine takes cash, but nothing bigger than $80. All I have is $100 bills. Every shop is closed because midnight. So I walk over to the info booth and I ask the guy, in English, where I can break a bill. English mode, because everyone in Montreal speaks English and French, right? That's what I knew. I have relatives there. They speak perfect English. Their kids went to English schools. I figured English works everywhere in that city. The guy looks at me, confused. Okay, I'm a non-native English speaker myself. I've been on both sides of a language barrier. I know the tricks. I restart. Slower. Simpler words. I point at the $100 bill. I point at the vending machine. He looks confused and maybe slightly annoyed, or uninterested, or just tired. I still don't know. What I know is that he doesn't answer me in English, and he doesn't answer me in French either. We just stand there, him behind the counter, me holding my 100, slowly running out of tricks, and the whole thing getting more awkward by the second. And standing in that awkward silence, I had the completely wrong thought. I thought, this is weird. Everyone here speaks English. It took me the rest of that night to understand what was actually going on at that booth, and it took the rest of the trip, plus a lot of curious digging afterward, to find out how much history was standing behind that counter with him. How French is Montreal, really? That's today's episode, French, one curiosity at a time. So, back to the airport where I'm still standing at that booth. What saved me was the lady sitting next to him. She finally spoke up, in English. You can try the exchange, around the corner there. Would a currency exchange break a Canadian 100 into smaller Canadian bills? Shrug. You have to ask them. They were done with me. The exchange guy, for the record, was lovely. He even counted out my change in small bills on purpose because he knew the vending machine gets fussy with the big ones. Anyways, I got my pass. Crisis over. And then 2 things happened at the bus stop that rearranged my whole picture of Montreal. Thing 1, small but personally triumphant. There were 2 bus stop signs, and one of them said, Descente seulement. Drop-off only. I read that, in French, and walked to the other, correct, sign. Nobody clapped. Internally, I clapped. Thing 2, standing in that line, I started actually listening, and everybody around me was speaking French. Everybody. The teenagers, the students, the airport staff out at the curb. Even when I caught a bit of English and thought, fellow Americans, 2 sentences later, they'd slide back into fluent French. And that's when I recognized it. I had seen this before. Not in Montreal. In Paris. Paris, where I once watched a friend ask for directions at a newsstand, in English, and get a look of pure disdain. Then I asked the same guy the same question in French, rusty, learner French, and suddenly it was a completely normal interaction. Same newsstand, same guy. So I knew this game, and I knew the move. From then on in Montreal, I opened every single interaction in French. Now, my French is rusty and broken, so within 2 or 3 sentences I'd hit a wall. Some word I didn't know, some phrase I couldn't catch, and I'd have to switch to English. And the English was always there. Perfect, fluent English. And friendly. Nobody sighed. Nobody looked annoyed. Nobody made me feel like a bother. They'd just switch with me mid-conversation and help me out. Every single time. So both things I'd heard about Montreal turned out to be true at once. Everyone speaks English, and French is the opening move. My family there had told me the city runs roughly 80-20, French to English, their gut feeling, not a census. And standing in that bus line, it stopped feeling like a percentage at all. It felt more like an unwritten rule about which language you're expected to start in. Which left me chewing on a question for the rest of the trip. Everyone here can speak both languages, so why does it matter so much which one you start in? And even before I got anywhere near the history, the French itself kept handing me little hints. Because the French I was hearing in Montreal was not quite the French I'd learned. It was weirder and a lot more fun. Okay, a few of those hints. The first thing I learned is that Quebec French is not Old French, and it's not Broken French, even though people have been calling it both for decades. There's a linguist at the Université de Montréal, Julie Auger, and she has this way of explaining joual, the working-class Montreal way of speaking that everybody used to sneer at. Her definition? It's a level of formality. That's the whole secret. Everyday, familiar French. You say char instead of voiture for your car. You let some English words in. You talk like that with your friends over a beer. And then you clean it up for a job interview. That one made me feel so much better. Because in Montreal, whenever I couldn't follow what someone was saying, I just assumed my rusty French was the problem. My fault. Study more. And now I find out that some of what I was hearing wasn't the French I learned at all. It was register. Friends over beer French, when everything I'd ever studied was job interview French. Those are different languages everywhere. Quebec just has particularly good ones. Then there are the sacre, the Quebec swear words. And this is the part I find delightful. They're Catholic. Christ, calice, tabarnak. Christ, chalice, tabernacle. I mean, the church sat on top of daily life here for so long that when people needed words with real firepower, they skipped the usual body parts entirely and went straight for the church equipment. And people conjugate them, stack them together, stretch them out. Very useful, apparently, when you're angry. And my favorite, the filler words. In France, everyone says du coup, constantly. Du coup this, du coup that. It's the French, so anyway. In Quebec, the word is fac. Fac. And people say you can track a French person's integration into Montreal through this one little word. They land at the airport saying du coup. A year or two later, fac. But here's the delicate part, and it's what makes this more than trivia. Some French newcomers say that if you keep talking too Frenchly, you risk being kept at arm's length. But if you swing the other way and imitate the Quebec accent too hard, now you might sound like you're making fun of it. There's a narrow little lane between too Parisian and is she mocking us? And every French person in Montreal is driving in it. So even the filler words are ID badges. They announce which club you're in, how long you've been here, and whether you come in peace. So that's the texture. The language itself keeps asking you where you stand. And I kept pulling on that thread. Why is a language this loaded here? Why does a filler word have a club membership attached? And the answers kept going further and further back. Back to a Montreal where the question at the door wasn't, do you speak French? It was the opposite question. And it decided whether you got the job. Élise Chèvrefille-Boucher grew up in the southwest of Montreal, in the factory neighborhoods along the canal. She was 15 when the other girls came to her with good news. And decades later, telling the story, she still slips into their voices. Élise, on a une belle job pour toi. Élise, we've got a beautiful job for you. At Northern Electric on St. Patrick Street. And you have to understand what La Northern meant in that neighborhood. It was the big one. Good pay. One woman from those same streets said that getting hired at the Northern was like winning the lottery in the neighborhood. People who worked there stood a little higher on the ladder. So 15-year-old Élise walks over to St. Patrick Street thinking, in her own words, I'm going to have a beautiful job. There are lots of young people there. She gets there, and the interview, the whole interview, is one question. And they ask it, get this, in both languages. Est-ce que vous parlez français? Do you speak English? She says no. Sorry, no job. Sorry, no job. Twice, in English. 15 years old, and her beautiful job is gone in one sentence she only half understood. And then she stands there long enough to notice the other part. An English girl comes in after her. And nobody asks the English girl, "Do you speak French?" No. You speak English? You've got the job. And this is Montreal, remember, a city where the majority spoke French. And Elise summed up the whole era in one line. C'était tout en anglais dans l'ancien temps ici. It was all in English in the old days here. She wasn't describing one bad employer either. These memories come from an oral history project. Researchers sat down with the old factory workers of Southwest Montreal, and the same picture comes back from every direction. Francine Gagnère, who started at 14 at a textile mill in Pointe-Saint-Charles, compressed the entire system into one sentence. Les anglophones, c'étaient les boss. Les francophones, c'étaient les petits. The anglophones were the bosses. The francophones were the little people. A man named Jean-Paul Bailey, who worked at the sugar refinery next door to the Northern, said you simply didn't get in there without English. And then he added this. He figured he had chances anyway because his name, Bailey, sounds English. Even if his actual English was barely there, he thought the name alone would have gotten him hired. His verdict on all of it, blunt as can be, c'était raciste. There's even a funny version of the same story. A man named Jean-Guy Dutil applied to work at the rail yards, like his father. To get hired, he had to write a 50-word application letter in English. He wrote it. Years later, they told him it was a beautiful letter, with 50 mistakes in it. 50 words, 50 mistakes, a perfect score. And this part links right back to the joual thing from earlier. Listen to how these workers talk in French about their own jobs. Elise's father worked at the paper factory. That's the word he used, factory, not usine. Francine answered to a forelady. Bailey hauled sugar sacks between the shed and the shipping and got promoted to helper for a pipe fitter. Their French was full of English, because the shop floor itself ran in English. The machines, the bosses, the job titles, all those anglicisms in everyday Montreal French that people would later sneer at, a lot of them were punched in, like a time card, at work. So picture the city this builds. French is the language of the home, the street, the majority, and English is the language of the paycheck, the boss's office, the language of up. That's the world Bill 101 crashed into in 1977. You might know it as the law that put French on all the signs. It's so much bigger than signs. Its architect, a psychiatrist turned minister named Camille Lorrain, wrote into law that every person in Quebec has the right to work, shop, study, be administered, treated, and judged in French. Everywhere. All the time. And look, a government deciding the language of workplaces and shop windows, that is a massive intervention. People have been arguing about it for 50 years, and this episode is not going to settle that argument. But after Elise at the factory door, you can at least hear the logic. There was already a language rule in Montreal. Nobody had voted on it. It came enforced by hiring desks and bosses' offices instead of by law. Bill 101 took an unwritten rule and flipped it into a written one. The law came in 1977, though, and the anger came first. Almost a decade before the politicians moved, the anger did something very Montreal. It climbed onto a stage. The stage part starts with a knock on a door in the fall of 1968. The one knocking is Michelle Rosignol, an actress, young, serious, one of the rising names on Montreal stages. And she has a problem. There's a big evening being put together, a benefit called Chansons et Poèmes de la Résistance, Songs and Poems of the Resistance, in support of two jailed militants of the independence movement. Real names on the bill, too. Gaston Miron, Pierre Montmorency, the famous poets of the moment are all participating. Which is exactly Rosignol's problem, because they'll be performing their own material, and she's an actress. She needs a text that doesn't belong to anyone yet. So she goes to see a poet named Michel Lalonde. And the way Lalonde remembered the ask years later, it was almost embarrassingly casual.
Elle est venue me voir en me demandant si je n'avais pas un texte qui traînait quelque part.
She came to ask if I didn't have some text lying around somewhere. And here's Michel Lalonde's life at that exact moment. She's 31, with 2 babies in diapers and a 6-year-old daughter. She does not have a text lying around somewhere. She says yes anyway. And she makes one promise about this text she hasn't written. It's going to passer la rampe. It's going to get across the footlights. Stage language. It means the words won't die at the edge of the stage. They'll land out in the seats. She also said later that she didn't feel like writing about dragonflies. So now she writes, standing up, because she knows an actress is going to perform this, so she's not writing for a page, she's writing for a voice, testing how it sounds on its feet. Then she types it up, 2 fingers, she's not a typist, on a typewriter with a sheet of carbon paper underneath, because she needs a second copy, and that's how you made copies in 1968. The performance is on a Monday in October at the Comédie Canadienne, a theater that's still there today, by the way. It's now the TNM, the Théâtre du Nouveau Monde. And Lalonde shows up with her freshly typed pages, carbon smudges and all, minutes before the dress rehearsal. And then, the scene I'd have paid to see. The poet and the actress go into the theater bathroom. In her words,
On est allé dans les toilettes de la Comédie Canadienne et je lui ai donné des indications.
We went into the bathroom, and I gave her directions. Standing between the sinks, the poet coaches the actress through it, where to press, where to hold back, and then Lalonde tells her,
Si tu le récites comme ça, tu vas voir. La salle va lever.
Recite it like this, and you'll see. The room will rise. The poem is called Speak White. And if that title makes you flinch a little, it's supposed to. Speak white was a real insult. It's what French speakers in Canada could get barked at them in that era for speaking French in public. Speak white, meaning speak English. 2 words with that whole era's racial hierarchy packed inside them. Lalonde took that insult and made it the poem's refrain. The poem keeps the command in English, throws it back over and over, while the French around it piles up everything the insult contains. Whose language is money? Whose language is the boss's? Whose language gets to give orders? She put her text on purpose on the most dangerous shelf in Quebec at that moment, alongside Pierre Vallière's book, Nègre Blanc d'Amérique, a book considered so incendiary it was barred from circulation. So, Monday night, October 1968, Rosignol walks out onto the stage of the Comédie Canadienne with a poem typed with 2 fingers and rehearsed in a bathroom. And Lalonde's promise, La salle va lever, the room will rise? She was wrong. The way she told it later, the room didn't just rise. The room was launched into the ceiling. And the poem kept rising for decades. The night everyone remembers came in March 1970, the Nuit de la Poésie, this legendary all-night poetry marathon in Montreal, by one description, the biggest celebration of the spoken word Quebec had ever seen. There's film of it, Lalonde herself at the microphone, delivering Speak White to a packed hall. That performance became one of the defining public memories of the whole era. When she died in 2021, more than 50 years later, the obituaries opened with those two English words. And put that next to Elise's factory door for a second. The same language that couldn't get a 15-year-old past a hiring desk, up on a stage in a packed theater, angry, magnificent, in charge of the room. A language that had spent decades being treated as lower status, standing up in public and refusing to sit politely. The next fight was quieter. It happened at school doors, and it's the part of this story my own family walked me right into, without any of us realizing it. When my relatives were showing me around Montreal, at some point on the drive, they pointed out the window. That's the English super hospital. And a bit later, that's the French super hospital. And I just nodded along, like that was a totally normal sentence. Two parallel hospital systems, sorted by language. That's the thing about Montreal a visitor can miss. It isn't one city with two languages floating around in it. It's a city with parallel institutions. English hospitals and French hospitals. English school boards and French school boards. Two of a lot of things, side by side, going back generations. My relatives' kids went to English schools. Perfectly normal in their world. But under Bill 101, most new immigrant families don't get that choice. Their children go to French school. And when I first heard that rule, it sounded strict to me. A government telling families which school system their kids belong to. Then I read about what came before it, and the picture got complicated in a direction I did not expect. Because before Bill 101, some immigrant families were trying to choose French school and getting turned away. A researcher named Guy Rogers went digging into what actually happened at those school doors, and instead of just reading official records, he interviewed the people who lived it. Students, teachers, administrators, a priest. And one woman told him about her own parents, back in the 1950s. These parents were immigrants, Italian-Canadian, which was the biggest immigrant community in post-war Montreal, and Catholic, like the French schools. And they weren't outsiders to the language either. They were bilingual, educated right there in Quebec. They brought their kids to the French Catholic school. And the nun told them, "We don't accept immigrants here. There are other schools for you." We don't accept immigrants here. So the simple version of this history, immigrants freely picked English, and the state later forced French on them, isn't what happened. At least not everywhere. Some families picked French first, and French said no. And that contradiction didn't stay quiet. It blew up spectacularly in the late 60s, in a borough called Saint-Léonard. There was a school program there that was supposed to integrate Italian kids into the French majority. Except it taught math and science in English. And by 1968, 85% of its graduates were heading to English high schools. Francophone parents saw their own city assimilating its newcomers into the other language, and they revolted. A movement formed, a school got occupied, and by September 1969, it was a street battle. About 1,000 people, 500 helmeted police, tear gas, and the Riot Act. The actual Riot Act, read out loud in a Montreal street. Over which language children would do their homework in. The first law that came out of that mess tried free choice and managed to make basically everyone angry. It took until Bill 101 in 1977 for the door to swing the other way. From then on, immigrant kids go to French school. And what does that rule feel like from the inside, a generation later? Grew up in Montreal speaking English and Tagalog at home. Because of Bill 101, her schooling was in French. then college and university in English, Thanier, McGill. Today, she's a borough mayor. And she says she's really grateful for Bill 101, because if her parents had had the choice, she figures they'd have picked the English system. For the most human reason there is, homework. The plain fear of not being able to help your kid at the kitchen table in a language you don't have. All that constitutional drama, and at one family's table, it comes down to homework. Meanwhile, the English Montreal that turned Elise away, it didn't vanish. It's all over the city's memory and all over its map. Mordecai Richler wrote about growing up on Saint-Urbain Street in the Jewish Montreal of the 30s and 40s, where the Main, Boulevard Saint-Laurent, was the border. For if the Main was a poor man's street, it was also a dividing line. Below it, the French Canadians. Above it, some distance above, the English. Even a tiny Anglo-Saxon fire insurance inspector could walk into a shop on the Main and watch powerful merchants bow and scrape and reach into a drawer for a bottle and call him sir. English in that Montreal worked like a rank. Today, the English institutions are still standing: school boards, hospitals, universities. The English School Board even runs enrollment ads pitched at parents in French. Être bilingue, c'est gagnant. Being bilingual is a winning move. Which I find kind of amazing. The English system advertising itself in French on the promise of both languages. And the best answer I found to my airport question is a woman in NDG, Notre Dame de Grâce, named Roxana Begum. She arrived from Bangladesh as a child speaking only Bengali. Primary school in French because of the law, and she mastered it. Later schooling in English. Her parents wanted their kids to have both, and they got both. But something slipped on the way through: her Bengali. Her mother speaks only Bengali, and sometimes Roxana reaches for a word now, and the English one arrives first. Today, she speaks English with her spouse, French and English with her daughter and the neighbors. She says she can't think of a single neighbor who speaks only one language. She switches all day, and she calls that the best way to do it. The official numbers more or less agree with her. In Greater Montreal, roughly 70% of people work mainly in French, about 20% mainly in English, and the rest use both equally. My family's 80-20 then wasn't wrong exactly. It was answering one question: how French is public Montreal? Roxana answers the other one: how bilingual are the actual Montrealers living in it? Both answers are true at the same time. That's the city. So, how French is Montreal really? Here's where I landed. French enough that opening in English at an airport counter can bring everything to a polite, confusing halt. English enough that 2 sentences after my French collapses, someone rescues me, beautifully, every time. And the guy at the info booth, I never did figure him out. Maybe he was tired, maybe I mumbled, or maybe I just started in the wrong language, at a counter with a couple of centuries of history stacked behind it. Next time, I'll start with Bonjour! Et voilà! À la prochaine fois!